with a focus on training and pre-training heifers for robot milking success. Our presenter is Jim Salfer. Jim is a regional extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. He has served in his present position for over 22 years. Before that, he managed a feed department, was a dairy nutritionist and district sales manager for an AI company, and managed a dairy farm. Jim has been involved on ag farm research projects, studying robotic milking systems and automatic calf feeders. The focus of his educational program has been to help farmers and other industry professionals understand the major factors driving dairy farm profitability and development in management strategies. Producers will learn about research and tips to successfully integrate heifers into a robotic milking system today. He'll cover strategies for pre-training, including early exposure and positive reinforcement, as well as hands-on training techniques to ensure a smooth transition. We'll learn how to reduce stress, optimize performance, and set the next generation of cows up for success in your automatic milking system. I remind listeners that this program will be archived on the I-29 Moo University website later this week. Please put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the page, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. In the chat box, I will put the link to the evaluation of this program. If you can please, at the end, take a couple of minutes to answer the questions. We use them to improve the webinar series. As I always say, Jim, the podium is yours.
Well, thanks, Fred, and thanks for the invite. This is really an interesting topic. I've spoke a lot on robots, but not particularly on this topic. And I think most of the research that's been done on this topic has primarily been in the last couple of years, so it's been fun to put that together. Also, make sure you put your questions in here, and so we'll get started here. The first thing I talk about a little bit, and I talked a lot about this, is kind of the topics for the day is going to be the goals of installing robots, because I think based on your goals might determine whether you're able to or want to pre-train heifers. I'll talk a little bit about nutrition and barn design, just a slide, I think, on each. The economics of early lactation visits, because that's really going to be our goal, right? If we want to train heifers, the only reason we would do that is to improve milk production, improve profitability. Then I actually get into some of the research. There's been about a half a dozen research projects that have been completed. So what does the research really show about pre-training heifers? And then the last couple of slides, I'm going to look at kind of fetching heifers to set them up for success, because I think it's one thing to pre-train. It's another thing, once they freshen and you move them onto robots, you need to have a strategy to kind of set those heifers up for success. So I think, what are your goals for installing robots? I like to go through this because I think oftentimes we think, I'm going to install robots because my neighbor did it. It's a trend in the industry. I think it's really important for all farms to think about specifically, what are your goals for putting in robots? Is it maximum productivity per cow and per robot? You might manage your robots a little differently if your goal is maximum productivity versus maximum lifestyle benefit. And I can take you to farms that I think their number one goal would be one of those two, and they would manage their farms differently. I think if you maximize your lifestyle benefit, you may have a few less cows per robot. Fetching may be less important to you because your goal is really to maximize that lifestyle benefit. If you want to maximize productivity, you're going to probably put more cows per robot. You're going to focus a lot more on milk per cow. That might be a farm that really focuses more on pre-training because they want to maximize productivity. Another reason people put in robots is to expand with minimal hired labor. You see a lot of that on smaller farms, and larger farms are looking at it. They want to expand the potential labor pool. A lot of people are willing to work in a robot barn where they may not be willing to stand in a parlor. So I think you really got to think about your goals when you're putting in robots. It's interesting because there's a lot of discussion on robots, and maybe this was more a decade or so ago about there was so much excitement and hype about robots. So I include this slide. I don't think my numbers might be accurate. I think maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago they were, but now the capital investments changed so much. Of course, labor's gone up. But there's nothing really unusual about robots. All they do is milk cows, and all we're doing is trading a higher capital cost for reduced labor costs. So, for example, on my left side, say you're milking labor, or your capital cost in your milking system is 350 with a robot. It's going to be higher. Robots are expensive. My goal, or in theory, I just want to reduce my labor cost, milking labor cost, to $1.50 a hundredweight. So I got $5 a hundredweight stuck in sort of my milking center capital and labor. With my parlor, I've got 250 as an example in labor or in capital costs and 250 in labor. So the goal is ideally to have these to be the same. And as I mentioned earlier, this isn't unusual, right? There may be nobody on this call is my age, but it was really common when I grew up. Kids went to college, silo and loaders went in, gutter cleaners went in. We purchased skid steer loaders. And all we were doing is trading labor, i.e., our children's labor, for capital. And so this isn't unusual. We do this all the time. And so, really, that's what robotic milkers are about. And that's all we're really trying to accomplish. One thing is, I think we need to understand if you're putting in robots, managing robot dairies is a little more complicated. You've got to deal with this training heifers. You aren't doing that in a freestall barn or tie stall barn. We got to train cows, particularly at startup. We've got ID sick cows. We've got technology that really can help us, but we're not out there interacting with animals all the time. And there's a lot of ways to do it. We just need I think we need a little different mindset, and we need a little different style of management. It's just a little more complicated because you got cows and the robot and the farmer and management, and they've all got to interact and intersect. So not better or worse, just different. The reason I put this in here is because I think there's been so much emphasis, and maybe not so much recently, on feeding pellets to the robot. That was initially, we did some early survey work, and there was so much discussion about these pellets. But I think it's important to remember that about 90% of our nutrients actually come from the TMR. And I think when I talk to farms that are really successful in robots, they'll all say, this really starts before calving, setting your animals up so they do well in the robotic system. And so we need excellent pre-calving management. And what that does is a lot of research shows that promotes high post-calving intake, promotes healthy cows, right? If we have them go through transition well, they're healthy, they feel good, they visit the robot, they're hungry, that drives milk production. High milk production drives high intake, that drives more high milk production. And it's just kind of this circle. And we end up with our goal of high visits, high production, high intake, and a healthy herd. But it really is important because in a robotic system, we don't have, I suppose it would be an advantage. If we have a cow that's not feeling good for a day or two and she's off a little bit, we're going to chase her to the parlor and she is going to get milked. In a robotic system, we're kind of, particularly a free flow system, we're kind of relying on that cow feeling good and being around. Recommended feed management. This is really no different than it would be, the bottom one is, but really no different than a parlor herd or any dairy herd for that matter. We want really good program. We want 80 to 90% freestall docking density in our pre-calving area because these cows are heavy with calf. They like to lay around. They kind of like to be by themselves. And we want 76 centimeters or about 30 inches of bunk space. These cows are big. They don't like to interact. They're not very aggressive. So as they get close, we just need a lot of bunk space for them. And sometimes you look at those bunks and you go, there aren't many cows here. We still need a lot of bunk space for them. And then we need to focus on the PMR. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of our nutrients are supplied through the PMR. So make sure we get that. We need something that supports high milk production, but also encourages cows to come to the robot. This is kind of what we want. We want high energy without and there's nothing wrong with good starch levels, but we do not want such a high starch level that we're going to get those cows kind of lazy. They're going to get full. Think about yourself at Thanksgiving. If you eat a lot of sugar or a high starch diet, you're going to get a little bit lazy and you're going to get filled up. So we want a cow, as you can see here, we want our rumen to fill up and we want it to empty pretty fast. So maybe what I should say is we want really good, high digestible, really good diets in that PMR. That cows eat, they get filled up, the rate of passage goes through, and we want it to stay up. And I'll show some slides actually about a little bit later that I think will emphasize this point. Switching gears a little bit, looking at some facilities. I think we got to think about facilities. They're just tools to implement management plans. That's all a facility is. So they should help us implement our management plans. Ideally, you want to allow for some future expansion if you can. We want to keep kind of a simple but a flexible layout. Really think about labor efficiency. That's one of the big advantages, and that's why we install robots. So you really got to think. Sometimes that means we need to do a bigger capital investment. But if we don't take advantage of labor efficiency in a robotic system, we're kind of losing some of the advantages. Think about how we can handle cows with one person as we're handling cows. However we need to do that, that means gates are your friend. That's always one of my comments when I'm working with dairy farmers, whether it's a parlor or Tysol barn. Gates are your friend. Fresh cows, and think about fresh cows and special needs handling. That's a little different in a robotic system. Ideal barn design, nothing new about this. We want an open space around the robots. We just want an area where timid cows can get around. I think when we think about robot barn design, I tend to think about those submissive cows. Our aggressive cows or our dominant cows, no matter what kind of system we're going to get in, they're going to get all the attributes. They're going to get all the needs that they want, right? If they want a freestall, they're going to get a freestall. They're going to get preferred freestalls. They're going to get in the robot when they want. We've got to think about these submissive cows. Ideally, we want the robot a little bit higher. That's basically to keep them clean. We want automatic feed pushing if we can, and an alley scraper. Again, that's just a labor issue. We want somewhere to sort cattle in a working chute. Ideally, again, these are ideally around robot area. We want an easy to do foot bath somewhere because otherwise it's not going to get done. And ideally, we want a kind of a protected area at the exit and the entry of the robot. I'll show a little video. I think it's maybe the next slide that'll, I think, emphasize what I mean by this. This is just a picture of a nice open area, kind of a nice barn design. You can see all of this open area that cows, if you've got a little bit more of a submissive area, if she doesn't have to go buy a boss cow, it's a little bit easier to get her into the robot. Guess here's my video. This is a barn I happened to be at. This was quite a few years ago. It's always one of our best performing robot herds. And this was a little bit of an accident. You see this cow in the bottom right here. She is, just based on her kind of the way she looks, she's probably kind of a submissive cow. You can see this cow standing right here, got her head up. Well, this is a cow with her head down, being a little bit more submissive to this cow. And see this cow behind it. I'm going to, hopefully my video play here, Fred. If not, we'll see. So you can see there's a cow obviously in the robot. This is kind of a protected area at the exit of the robot. And you see this cow is there. Her head kind of stays down like because she's trying to get in the robot. You can see a cow behind her kind of bunting her, but she's somewhat protected in here. A boss cow, either of these boss cows can't really get her away. And you can see when you got this dual entry where it's a swinging gate, what I mean by dual entry, she's protected. She can get right into the robot. Another cow can kind of get in this queue. This was kind of an accidental design. You can see their fetch pen back here. You can see the gates. This is a retrofit system in a barn. And so I think we can think strategically around about how we can design that area around the robot to make it easier for submissive cows to come in. You say, well, what does this have to do with pre-training heifers? It actually has more to do with allowing heifers to get in after they calve, be protected, because as a group, they're going to be the most submissive animals in your herd. But I thought I'd show this because I think it really is. I have a lot of interest around this design around the robotic area. And I think we could do a better job because some robots barns just perform better than others. And I think part of it is how we design that area. Okay, keys to success with robot: high milk per cow and per robot, and early lactation visits. And I'll show some data. Early lactation visits promotes early intake and high milk production. High early lactation visits typically mean we're going to have higher late lactation visits. And there's a reason we milk cows 3 times a day, versus twice a day. We do it to get more milk production. And we can really, if we get really good visits in early lactation, we get that milk production throughout the rest of lactation. And again, I'll show some of that data actually in robotic dairies a little bit later. And I think most listeners are probably familiar with the data, the 3X, and there's been 3X and 6X milking that Jeff Dahl did a number of years ago looking at that. And high milk per robot is correlated with high milk per cow is correlated with high milk per robot. We pick that up in our studies all the time. There's been other people that have picked that up. This is just some data from Mike Brook, and he went into a herd. This is just kind of one herd, so it's not really a research study, but I think it kind of as a demonstration it shows. And he went in and looked at cows that visited, average number of visits in early lactation, and then how that equated to milk production in that period of time. So if we got less than about two visits on cows, 50 days in milk, they average about 50 pounds of milk. And you can see the average. I guess this is in kilos. And then if they average 3 visits, they average 90 pounds or 88 pounds. And if they were at 70 days in milk and average 4 visits, they milked about 95 pounds. The other thing you'll notice, and I'll show this in the slide, is as we get more and more visits, we tend to get a diminishing return effect. So I'm not sure the right number is, but I'm not sure we need all cows visiting 4 or 5 or 6 times, and even early lactation. And you can see mid-lactation, you see the same trend. They're only visiting 1.9 times. You get 60, 80, and 100 pounds. And these are heifers only, first lactation. I think this is some interesting. This is from Jocelyn Boudre. Just some really early lactation. What she did is she went into a few herds. This is 5 herds over in Wisconsin. These are all free flow barns. And she just made a cut point and said, I want to look at cows that milk less than 3X. And this was at 3 weeks in milk. So she got into the records and said 3 weeks in milk, were they milking on average of 3 times a day, less than 3 times a day, or more than 3 times a day. And then she looked at production through the first 150 days. So if I explain that again, if she looked at production, are they at 3 weeks? Are they milking less than 3 times a day, more than 3 times a day? And then kind of looked at production after that. Average lactation number is 2.53. So if they were at 3X or more milkings by day 22, and this isn't quite statistically significant because they only had a couple of herds, but it's awful close. They, from day 50 then through 150 days in milk, you can see the graph on the 2 groups of cows. They average 6 more pounds of milk from day 22 through day 150. Now they likely milk more times per day out here, but the point is if we can get them off to a really good start and we're milking more than 3 times a day at 22 days in milk, at 3 weeks in milk, we're likely to see that effect, whether it's milk production or probably even visits. 11.8% more fat and also 23% more protein per day. She also tried to look at this from a profitability standpoint, and you can see she looked at, this is based on milk prices from July of 2022 to December of 2024. So she looked at kind of the average milk price during that period of time, the minimum milk price during that period of time, and the maximum milk price during that period of time. What this graph shows, and why I put it up here, is it kind of shows the advantage of diminishing returns as you get from, I'll use an example, 4 to 5 visits per cow per day. there's less of an advantage from a profitability standpoint, and of course, less of an advantage in milk production. So it's the key seems to be is to try and get those fresh cows milking at least 3 times a day or 3 to 4 times a day if we can. But if you look at this profitability, you look at $1.34 to $1.56, or I'm sorry, $1.05 to $1.56 from the minimum milk price and the maximum during that period of time. And if you look at the profit per cow from day 22 to day 150, and just as a reminder, again, we were looking at this 3x, or they were looking at this 3x day 22 in milk, greater than 3x or less than 3x. It equated to a minimum of $135 per cow during the first half of lactation, up to $200 per cow. So there really seems to be an advantage, both an economic advantage and a milk production advantage, of try and get those cows within the first few weeks up to being milked 3 times per day. Some herds kind of struggle getting visits in early lactation. This is some data that we did. And the first 4 numbers on the bottom here are week of lactation. So this is up to the first 28 days. Then after this, it's a month. So this is 28 to basically 50 days in milk. So this is primiparous cows, heifers, and this is multiparous cows, so older cows. And you can see that older cows that had been exposed to robots, so the older cows had already been on robots in previous lactation, they get off to good starts fast. I mean, by the second week in lactation, they're milking on an average of more than 3 times per day. But these heifers get off to kind of a slow start. This is looking across 32 different herds. These are all free flow barns looking at 4th week milking frequency. So when they were in their 4th week, and you can see the heifers here, this particular herd, even by the 4th week, was only milking twice a day. This one's only, so we had 5 of these 32 herds were just milking at 3 times or twice a day, or barely over twice a day. And if our goal is 3x in these particular herds, there were only 3 herds, so about 10% of them, where these heifers were actually averaging 3 times a day milking. So I think there's some things we could do to really try and improve that. Now, this is a herd this was kind of a retrospective study looking back at what they did, but this was a herd that was able to, they actually expanded their barn. They had some robot space. They calved in their robot barn, and their pre-fresh heifers were in a pen right next to a robot. So they thought, well, we got some robot time. We'll actually chase them through the robot. And you can see kind of when they did not train heifers versus during the period of time when they trained heifers. And this is just visits. So you can see how much the increase was when they actually pre-trained heifers, and they pre-trained them for 3 weeks. So they go in there twice a day, and this particular farmer said it took about a half an hour. And so again, they did this for multiple weeks, and you can see when you get to like out here, it's at least a half a visit. And here you're almost a whole visit extra that those cows did. And they maintained this all the way through 210 days in milk. So it seemed like, at least in this situation, when we pre-trained them for 3 weeks, we maintained these non-pre-trained heifers never really caught up. They got close. I mean, they're getting a little bit closer, but they never really caught up to the heifers that were pre-trained for 3 weeks. This is some data that was done in Germany, actually. And what they did is they called it a phantom robot. So it wasn't a robot. They had it in their pre-fresh pen, but they were introduced to this phantom robot 4 weeks before calving. So about a month before calving, they had this in one group. And then, of course, the control cows, they didn't have access to this phantom robot. They fed in there. There was no milking. Again, they called it a phantom robot. And you can see this is a portion of animals that had to be fetched for milking. And you can see out here by day, and you can see statistically for the first, this is just days, for the first 5 days, they had considerably less fetching with the cows or heifers that were exposed to the phantom robot. So again, this would indicate there's clearly an advantage of, at least these two studies would show that there's clearly an advantage of pre-training heifers. Okay, this is the same study that looked at pre-trained heifers had higher milking frequency, data 4 to 7, statistically had higher number of milkings per day. Now we're in shifting studies. This is a Canadian study that was just recently done where they trained heifers just 4 days and they trained them 3 times a day. And their thought process was, well, we want our heifers to milk 3 times a day, so let's pre-train them 3 times a day. And this is just an ease of entry score. So how easy it was to get the cows into the robot. I thought this was kind of interesting. So it was really a challenge that first time on day 1. The cows struggled to get into the robot. Then they got easier training 2 and 3 that same day. But then on second and third day, it actually got a little bit harder for them again. But you can see what happened. They made it progressively more of a challenge. Here, they just chased them through the robot. Once they got exposed to the robot arm, they got a little bit more of a challenge to train them. It seemed like they did not like that. And I think it's key to remember, this was just 4 days of training, 3 times a day. However, you can see, even though it was a little harder to train, the behavior scores improved after calving with pre-training. So the milk letdown score, which was, they just categorized, not real scientific right here, good, acceptable, poor, bad. They were statistically improved by pre-trained heifers. Kicking was no different. So they both kicked after, but numerically a little bit better. Ease of entry was quite a bit better. So you can see here the control animals. So even though it looked like it got a little bit worse once they got pre-trained, once they freshened, got them on the robot, the ease of entry score got better. And then the ease of entry score from day 3, this was the first 6 milkings, so the first 3 days. And then the ease of entry score stayed better up to 21 days in milk. So again, it kind of shows that even though we maybe did see a lot, and they were getting a little bit more challenged, these pre-trained heifers did have better behavior once they freshened. Here's a control in pre-trained heifers. So looking at fetching, and most of the fetching and milking parameters did improve after calving. And the number of fetches, and again, a lot of these you can see were averaged across the first 3 weeks after calving. So I highlighted in green the ones that were statistically improved. So it's not a huge number, but the pre-trained heifers did have less fetches. They had a lot more visits. Milkings were not much different. But again, part of milkings is milk permission settings. So you kind of see this sometimes pretty often. You see, well, statistically, we didn't see a lot of improvement in milkings. But again, part of that is determined by milking permission settings. The other thing that's unique is both of these groups, they didn't stress these robots a lot. They didn't have a lot of cows on these robots. And so both groups had really good visits. And it trended towards significance. Kickoffs were no different, kind of like their last. Voluntary visits were quite a bit higher. Voluntary visits per day were higher. Milk yield was pretty statistically higher, significantly statistically higher, from 68 to 72 pounds. First voluntary visit was higher. That was the day being milked in the AMS. And the first voluntary milking was statistically not different, but the visits were higher. And that might be due to milking permission settings. So, it maybe trends toward there's some advantage of doing this, at least in this situation, training 4 days, not really stressing the robots a lot. I think this is an interesting study too when you look at it. This is association between the time budget of frumivorous cows and their adaptation to automatic milking systems. Again, they looked at high fetch cows and low fetch cows. And what's interesting about this study is they actually looked at the The previous study that I showed, this study, this is a subset of that study. So now they looked at, after calving, which cows were high fetch and low fetch. And they just arbitrarily decided that the high fetch cows were going to average greater than a half a fetch per day. The low fetch cows were fetched an average of less than a half a time per day after day 7. So their cutoff was day 7. They looked at after day 7, cows that they had to fetch greater than half a time per day. They considered high fetch just arbitrarily. And the other ones were low fetch, were fetched less than a half a time per day. And again, this was a retrospective study. They just looked back at the study. So you can see, obviously, the high fetch cows, since we were looking at fetching, had a higher fetching rate. You can see the number of milkings per day. Not surprising. The low fetch cows had more milkings per day. And this is maybe not quite so clear, other than this is a number of visits. And not surprising, the cows that were the low fetch cows had more numbers of visits. So I think this is kind of interesting. They looked at some behavior things. So this is a research farm in Canada where they can actually measure intakes. They have bins where they can look at total intake of these cows. So they looked at some pre-partum behavior. I think this is kind of interesting. Again, the high fetch cows are here, the low fetch cows are here. So you look at the intake, TMR intake, pre-calving was no different. The feeding duration was different. Actually, the high fetch cows spent more minutes per day feeding than the low fetch cows. The number of visits to the feed bins, so they had bins where the cows went in, they could measure how much time they spent in those or the number of visits they made. And here, the ones that were low fetch cows actually had more visits per day pre-calving. If you look at post-calving, 0 to 23 days in milk, so during the fresh period, dry matter intake again was no different. These cows ate the same amount. Feeding duration, kind of the same trend as up here. The high fetch cows had more minutes of eating. However, the number of bin visits were actually much higher for the low fetch cows. You can see the milkings per cow per day quite a bit higher for the low fetch cows. Again, not surprisingly, because they looked at low fetch cows. AMS visits per day, quite a bit higher. The milk yield was quite a bit higher. Part of their conclusion is that they looked at this. These low fetch cows were clearly just more active. They went to the feed bins more often. Their conclusion was, and they didn't really measure activity, but by default, they kind of argued, these researchers, that these cows were snooping around the barn a lot more. They went to visit the bins. They were just a little more curious cows, and that maybe caused them to be pre-fetch cows. I think the other really interesting thing in this trial is look down here. Remember, this was a subset of the previous trial where they did pre-training. 7 of this group of cows, the high fetch cows, 7 of them had been pre-trained, 4 had not been pre-trained. If we look at the low fetch cows, 4 of those received pre-training, 7 did not receive pre-training. And this is where it gets a little bit muddy. So if we would think, boy, pre-training really is going to help fetching after calving, not necessarily. 7 of the low fetch cows never received pre-training. 4 of these cows never received pre-training. So if we think pre-training really helps, 7 of our high fetch cows were pre-trained. Only 4 of these low fetch cows weren't. So the data is a little bit muddy, even though it looked like it maybe on the previous study. It's not quite as cut and dried as you think. And the difference between this and the previous studies, and you'll see this maybe a little bit more. Remember, these cows were only pre-trained for 4 days, 3 times, so 12 total times. So I think that's maybe the most interesting thing. You know, this I guess you'd expect, but I think it's really interesting to be thinking about that. Maybe not quite as cut and dried as you think it is. This is some data, a little bit older data. It's out of Sweden. And these cows were pre-trained an average of 2 weeks before calving. So again, a little longer pre-training period. And you can see this is basically had shorter milking intervals. So they looked at times between milking for the first couple weeks before lactation. So the untrained animals had a longer interval between milkings versus the trained heifers, the pre-trained heifers. And this, again, not surprising based on the last slide. This is milk yield over 24 hours. And so they got milk more frequently. And so you can see they produce more milk during this entire period of time. So over a 3-week period of time. So again, not too surprising. But these heifers were pre-trained about 2 weeks before calving. I'm shifting gears a little bit. This is a Canadian study. You can see by the same author. And this is actually on cows, naive cows that had never been exposed to the robot before. And so there's a reason in a couple slides I'll get to this. So they kind of did training. So you can see the regimented here again, training, and then training day 1, 2, 3, 4, for 4 days of training. These cows, these were the pre-trained cows. So the pre-trained cows in this treatment, ENB, they were exposed to the robot only. In the MEC treatment, the gray treatment, they were exposed to the robot plus the mechanics of the robot arm going under them. The PEL treatment, they were exposed to the robot plus the mechanics of the robot arm plus feed. So these were basically the different lines are how much exposure to the robot did they get. And you can see pretty similar here. Statistically on day 3, they had where the robot plus the mechanics were a harder entry. Again, this is voluntary. They just walked in. This is confined with a gate. This is human encouragement. So they kind of had to be pushed in. This is, they just arbitrarily called it strong encouragement. So that maybe means they have more multiple people that were helping. And you can see these cows, once they got exposed to the mechanics, they were a little bit harder to get in than if they were just exposed to the, either exposed to mechanics and feed or to the robot only. So if they only had access the robot going under them, they didn't necessarily like that a whole lot. But this is kind of an interesting slide. Again, now we're looking at after they're on the robot. This is our ease of entry score. Once they're milking, so that was just the trainings. This is after they're milking for the first 3 milkings. You can see these ease of entry scores were better when milking for animals exposed to the robot only or robot plus mechanics plus feed. So you can see the ones that were exposed to the robot plus the mechanics. This is a control. The blue line is the control. That was really pretty similar, at least the first milking, to the ones that were exposed to the robot plus the mechanics. So I don't know if they could remember why the cows, I'm trying to think about how a cow might would think, but they really needed a little more encouragement to go in, were the ones that were exposed to robot only or robot plus feed plus mechanics. Statistically, they went in better. So maybe it's thought they didn't realize that this robot was going to go under them. Then they got a little bit worse. But you can see that the ones that were exposed to everything, they went down over time. Statistically, these are all the same. So this is only, and again, remember, these were cows that were trained, so not really heifers, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about the behavior and what might be going on here. This looks at number of visits. So this is that same trial. Not trained heifers had more visits and fewer fetching events than cows exposed to the robot and the feed. So these were the ones that had everything pre-calving. So robot, I should have had mechanics on here too. So the PEL was robot plus feed plus mechanics. They did number of visits per day. They were actually a little bit lower. And you can see over here, it kind of jumps around. But I think my point of these 2 slides is just to show it's not quite as cut and dried as you think. And I get it, these are cows. but they're also naive cows. At least the pre-trained ones are not naive cows. So it's not quite as clear why these animals that were exposed to everything actually had a lower number of visits than the cows that even the control cows, they visited pretty well. So I think the data is kind of out there. And again, I've emphasized this a couple of times. Maybe it's just the number of times they were trained or the number of days they were trained. We've got a few farms. These are actually both pictures of farms in Wisconsin. This one wasn't done. This is a farm in Wisconsin that had set up a little kind of a phantom robot, I suppose you would call it, D-Label phantom robot in a pre-fresh pen. This is obviously mimicking a Lely, and there's no mechanics here. This is a homemade built structure that the cows could go in and get a few pellets there, be hand fed. So there's a little bit of that going on. So I'm shifting gears a little bit. So that's kind of the moral of the story, or really the pre-training is. There's been a number of studies that have been done. It's not real clear. It does clearly appear if you train them long enough for at least a couple of weeks, that pre-training really does help. It might help the behavior and stuff after that, but not quite as cut and dried if you only train them a couple of days. Now I'm shifting gears a little bit and talk about why we fetch cows, because I ask people when we get on farms, and it's a big hot topic, right? How many animals are you fetching? And I always think people got to think about these animals differently because there's different categories, I think, of fetching. To me, we're not fetching these cows, we're training them. And that's my point. These are all groups of cows that we can think about. But I want to emphasize that we are not fetching fresh cows. We need to change our mindset. We are training them. No different than when I train my dog. We need to teach them the behavior that we want them to practice. And I think we really need to be thinking about that when we're training heifers. And I think it might make us think a little bit differently. Because one of the concerns about people, here, get heifers off to a good start, up in this slide. Training heifers, we want them to practice the behavior you want in early lactation. So again, we're training them. We want to teach them, just like training a dog. And I think we get high visits early, we get high visits late. And one of the reasons those Canadian studies fetch 3 times a day is I said, if we want to train our heifers to go in 3 times a day, we've kind of got to practice that with them, right? If we fetch them twice a day, are we just training them to only go in a couple of times a day? Do they have an internal clock? I think is part of it is. Do they have an internal clock that, well, now it's about time for me to go? So I think the first couple of days, it's kind of important, especially if they've never been exposed to the pen. Let's kind of teach them about the entire pen. I think guided flow people do this kind of by trade because they've got to walk them through the gates. But I think even in a free flow system, I think there's some advantage of kind of going in and walking around the pen and kind of getting used to this. This is a robot area. And just so they kind of get a lay of the land. And then my encouragement to farmers, I don't think if you're in a small farm, large farms, it's easy if you got employees, that you necessarily have to say, boy, I'm going to fetch them at 5 in the morning and at noon and at 8 o'clock at night or whatever it is. I think I do your typical fetches, your morning and evening fetch. And if you can, I think it'd be nice to go in 1 or 2 times between there. I don't think it has to be the same time. I think it's been 2 or 3 hours since you've been through there. And I think it's important to be a little stealthy maybe with these robots or cows. I think it's important if every time I go in a pen, I've got heifer number 1, I go in, I walk through her pen, I get her up, I walk her to the robot. Am I training her to be fetched by me? Likely. I mean, she's thinking, oh, Jim's here, I'm going to go. So I think you've got to be a little bit tricky in maybe getting them up, but get a rag, clean off the stalls, and kind of guide them instead of chase them. I mean, that's a little bit of it's a fine line, but I think it's make them think it's their idea going into the robot. So you're just guiding them toward the robot. And then ideally it's good. They're going to go, oh, this is up here. Last time I went into the robot, I got really good feed. And so instead of just getting them up, walk in and say, I'm in a hurry, I've got to get into that robot. So you get them up, you chase them right to the robot, you chase them in and they go, well, okay, I guess this is how this works, right? When Jim wants me to go to the robot, he's going to come and get me. So I think it's a little bit, it might take longer when we're training them, but good training means better behavior later. Okay, in summary, a high number of milking visits, I think we probably know that in early lactation lead to high production, at least through 150 days in milk. And again, this data has been done. That's why we started milking cows 3 times a day. We know if we can get them milk a lot in early lactation, that will equate to milking more milk later on, even if milking visits drop some. I think the data, as I mentioned, on pre-training is kind of mixed. It's not real clear, but clearly it shows that if you train heifers for a longer period of time, they did have more visits and produce more milk. I think, does pre-training fit in your facility and management scheme? I'm not here to say you have to do it. It has to fit within what you do. And I think this focusing on fetching lactation heifer fetching make more sense in your dairy than pre-training, because I think there's another option, right? Once they freshen and get in there, we're just going to make a concerted effort to try and make them get through that robot more creatively. And a couple of things, I'll tell a story of a couple of different farms that we've been on and what maybe they've done. There was a farm that inadvertently, or not inadvertently, their nutritionist felt they should breed their heifers AI, and the heifers tended to be on pasture. So they would bring heifers up at breeding time. So these were heifers, year-old heifers or so. They would put collars on them. They put them in the robot barn because they could handle. And they'd let them in there until they showed a heat and they got them bred. So those heifers were probably in there, 30, 40, 50 days, for sure 20 days. And then they turned it back out to pasture. And that dairyman was pretty convinced that those heifers kind of remembered going through that robot, because they let them go through the robot. They didn't milk them. They could eat some pellets. They didn't necessarily pre-train them. They chased them through a couple times, but then it was sort of accidental. They liked the food. And that dairy producer really believed that those heifers could remember 9 months later that they had been through that robot. But remember, I don't know, and I don't doubt that. I mean, that might be true. But remember, they were in there for quite a few days versus the training in some of these research trials where they just trained in 4 days. Another farm that I've just recently worked with, that they are now, and it's only been a couple of months, they will put before the heifers go to the pre-fresh pen, so they come out of their heifer pen, before they go to the pre-fresh pen, they put them in their robot dairy. They don't even necessarily, and this is a guide flow system, so they walk through the gates, get used to the gates, and so they really don't have a lot of data or experience, but they thought maybe it helped them. At least they were a lot more used to the barn and used to kind of the sort gates. And they were leaving in there again for a few weeks, and then they'd go to the pre-fresh pen. So again, that would, it takes a little bit of work, but really not a lot on their part to kind of chase them through the gates. But they got a little bit of TMR, and so that worked pretty well for them. So I guess my point is, there's some creative ways you can kind of think about this in your dairy and what might work. But I can't stand here and tell you, boy, if you pre-train and walk them through your gates and get them through there, if you do it for a day or 2 or 3 even, that you're going to see such a big difference. But it does appear that if you do it long enough and kind of give them access, that clearly that will improve maybe the performance of those heifers and maybe make your life a little bit easier once they freshen. So just as a general comment, overall, help the robot succeed. And make sure you get the right feed tables. These have nothing to do with pre-training heifers. Get the right employees, the right mindset. Again, part of the mindset is, what am I going to do to help these cows succeed? I think it's really important to do that. Good barn design, maintain robot cleanliness, and ultimately select the right kind of cows. Need a whole system. So that's kind of my talk there, Fred.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to remind everybody, if you have questions, you can either put them into the chat box. We're a small enough group, I think 17 right now. If you want to unmute and go ahead and ask a question, uh, I'll give just a few seconds and see who steps up. Otherwise, we've got a few questions that have come in.
If you've got a question on study, I see Jalissa on the presentation today, so you could probably ask her. That was a Wisconsin study. She just got done for her master's.
Okay. Early on in the discussion, you mentioned gait issues. What were the gait issues that you saw were the most problems? Lack of, wrong placement? What issues are you talking about?
Lack of gates. I don't think people put gates enough. I think they can be your friend. For example, in a free flow system, when you're trying to fetch cows, a lot of people put a gate down and then walk cows behind them, so they just can't go in a circle and run around. And so I think, and again, this isn't unique to robotic dairies. I just think we really, are gates cheap? No, but they're not expensive either compared to an extra person. So think about where you can strategically place gates to make it easy for one person to handle. Maybe there's some listeners on here like being cowboys, but I think it's a lot easier if we're not a cowboy and we don't have to rope them and chase them around for half an hour before we want to do what they want to do. So just my general comment is kind of think about where you need and would like gates, where a gate can really help you calmly move a cow.
Too many gates is always better than too few, right?
Yes, my famous saying is use gates and get to heaven. Because my experience is if you don't have enough gates, bad language comes out of your mouth. It just does. We get really frustrated. Where a gate or two can help us.
Yeah. Okay, you also mentioned permission settings were problematic. Tell the folks what you mean by that.
Well, permission settings is basically there's a couple of things we can set when we make milk permission settings. We can set it by basically hours, so a cow's allowed to go in so many hours, and or milk production. And so I think sometimes what we do when cows get up in milk, we sometimes give them too much access, like mid lactation cows. We give them too much access, and that doesn't it ties up too much robot time for these fresh cows to get in. So I think we're getting a lot better, but I know some farms have kind of changed some of those permission settings. Work with your nutritionist, work with the robot companies, and just make sure, especially as your robot gets fuller, that we don't allow these mid or late lactation cows to go in too often. We want a full udder and they'll milk faster, right? We don't want a cow that's going to go in that's only got 10 pounds of milk in her udder. It takes the same amount of time to prep. They milk let down slower. I think we need to get full udders coming in there. And we don't need to milk cows after 200 days, even if she's milking a lot of milk. She doesn't have to be milked 3 or 4 times a day. She can milk 2.5 times a day. So I think just work with your companies and make sure we get those permission settings set correctly. So we have room for the fresh cows to get through multiple times.
Were you able to identify flaws that kept the heifers below the 3x milking before training? Was there specific things that the training did?
I don't think so. I think one of the and I don't think this is so much now, but a decade or so ago, I think people kind of had this attitude that, by golly, if I let their udders get full enough, they'll go through. And I think they did that a little bit too early. I think you can try a little bit of that. You've got to think about your management and how that works. But I think the challenge, I would go to farms, kind of like that one slide, and I would look at milk production for the first 20 days. And the average number of milkings on one farm was 1.7. And that was kind of their attitude. By golly, if they aren't going through after a week, I'm going to let them go. And if they go 18 hours, they go 18 hours. And for all the listeners out there, how do we dry up cows? One of the ways we dry up cows in late lactation is we go to once a day milking, right? We want them to quit milking. Now we're taking our fresh heifers that are fresh for 2 weeks and we're saying, we're going to let you go 18 hours. I mean, to me, that just doesn't click. And I sort of understand the logic, but I think we also have to understand physiologically, when we let a cow go a long time and don't milk her, we are essentially, even if she's a fresh cow, we're drying her up. So I think it's really important to really think about that.
Mario's asking the question, what's your comments on farms that fetch always at the same time of day? Example, 6 to 8
6 and
a.m.
8. Yeah. I think most farms try to mix that up a little bit if they can. And part of that, I think, is just what I kind of talked about. And maybe that's what Mario is trying to get at. If, there's some cows, if they're, again, I'm fetching this cow all the time at 6 o'clock, they kind of a little bit have this internal clock. And I think if you say, well, okay, today I'm going to fetch from 8 to 9 instead, some of those cows, and you'll hear that pretty common from dairy producers, they'll go, yeah, then she went in on her own. And I think part of it is they go, well, okay, I guess I'm kind of supposed to go. My internal clock says, so I guess I'll get up and go. So I think there is a little bit of, and there's a lot we don't know about barn design and cow behavior. I think there's some people working on that, but I think that's maybe what Mario is getting at. And I think there is some truth in that. Kind of mix up your fetching times, and that's not that hard to do. So I think if we can do that, and especially if we're kind of fetching 3 times a day, then if it gets a little bit longer, that's fine. Some of this happens by farms by example, right? I'm to a wedding. I normally fetch at 5. I'm to a wedding. I don't get home till 8. I go out at 8 o'clock and I get my cows. But I think mixing it up sure doesn't hurt anything.
Okay. If folks want to unmute, they can ask a question direct. Otherwise, they can type in a question. I've got two. Mario followed up with, can you discourage cows by overfetching?
I think again, it depends upon the group of cows that you are doing it with. I think if you're doing that late lactation cows, I think you can. I think again, I'll go back to my training heifers. I had a really good discussion with a farm. I don't think she's on, but it was a farmer and I was there and I just asked her because that was a big thing when we started this. How often do you fetch, et cetera, et cetera. And she looked at me and her question was, can cows tell time? I thought that was just a really good question. I said, explain to me more. She said, I don't think cows can tell time. So she said, my theory is she fetched her heifers 4 times a day. And I think she's partly correct by this. Her argument is it's not the number of days you fetch cows, it's how many times they are fetched. So her argument is if I fetch a heifer 4 times a day versus twice a day, they're going to it's a number of fetches. They're going to learn in half as many days. And I'll say that when I train my dog, I'll go back to that. It's not the number of days I train my dog, it's the amount of time, the number of repetitions I do is what causes them to learn. Just think about yourself learning spelling or learning something else. It's sort of the number of times you practice that. So I guess my point is, I think could you fetch them too often? Could it discourage them? I don't think so much. I think if you would fetch heifers 4 times a day, I don't think it would necessarily discourage it as long as you're kind of smart about it. I don't know any reason you'd surely do it more than 4 times a day. I think 3 is probably the right number, but I do think if it's later lactation cows and these are these knuckleheads that only go through twice a day, I think I'm to the point where, and I think a lot of farmers are. If you've got a cow, even if she's milking heavy, she's 150 days in milk. She goes in twice a day religiously. She didn't read the book and know she's supposed to be milked 3 times a day. She just didn't read the book. She's going to go in twice a day and leave her going twice a day and call it a day.
Did you see any, or have you noticed any breed differences uh, as far as using parlors or using AMS?
What was that again? I'm sorry, Fred.
Have you seen any breed differences in
Oh,
how they train heifers in AMS?
I don't know if you pre-train them. I will hear, and we did not pick this up. We did have one herd in our first study that was all jerseys. And it might be because our numbers were so long. But people that have jerseys will argue they go in a lot better, that they are just curious little buggers. And I think we all understand jerseys. There is one farm in Minnesota, and we never really followed up with them to do a research study there. But they had half jerseys and half Holsteins. They had jerseys on one side of the barn. They had two robots. And one side of the barn, they put all their jerseys. The other side of the barn, they put all their Holsteins. And their jerseys consistently had more visits than their Holstein. So I don't know of any formal research studies that have done that. I said we have one herd, but one herd, we didn't really pick it up statistically. There was no different. But just anecdotally, people will go, those darn jerseys, they really go through your barn. They really go through the robot. But otherwise, we just don't have enough numbers to know.
We've talked about boxes and, the systems we see, but Jim, have you seen the robots that are used in stall barns in Canada? Do we have any of those around our area?
I have never personally seen them. If people are interested in your tie stall, but if you Google it, you can find them. There's a couple of companies that make them. One in Canada, or used to be one in Canada and one in France. They're probably still making them. I actually contacted the company in the U.S. to try, or I'm sorry, the company in Canada, and encouraged them to come to the U.S. But they just didn't seem to have interest. And I tried to encourage them. You look at Pennsylvania and kind of the upper Midwest here, we've got a lot of smaller herds and tie-stall barns that I think they'd be very interested in milking with robots. But for whatever reason, if they don't think they could get a network dealer established, but that was quite a few years ago. And obviously, I don't know of any in the U.S. I don't know of any dealers with them. But I think you've seen them, Fred, right? They're kind of
Yep,
interesting, aren't they?
they are. They're really different than what we see from a box system. I use the term clunky just because they ride on the gutters. But anyway, I just didn't know if we
Yeah.
had any.
And they go from cow to cow to cow.
Yep,
They kind of, the one I've seen, they kind of attach to the hips to hold the cow, and then they kind of go underneath the cow and milk the cow. But an interesting concept.
yep. Well, to remind people, this program will be archived on the I-29 MU University uh, webpage. I would ask that you consider clicking on the link for the evaluation of today's program. Uh, Again, thank you, Jim. I appreciate the information that you've shared. Do you have any last minute take that you want to share with the people?
Well, I think the only comments, again, I've emphasized a lot during the call. I think that the data purely on pre-training is a little bit mixed, but it does appear that if you train them long enough, there's clearly an advantage. If you're going to train them just 2 or 3 days, I think um, you can do it, but don't be surprised if you don't see a lot of improvement. And the other thing, I think it's really important to kind of, in early lactation, try and figure out a system where we can get those cows milked multiple times, because I think clearly a few more milkings, 3 times a day milking is clearly better from a profitability standpoint and from a milkings per cow per day standpoint than less than 3 times a day, or for sure twice a day.
Very good, Jim. We appreciate your time and the information you shared. And remind that the I-29 group does this on a monthly basis. We'll look forward to seeing you next month. I'll go ahead and sign off.